Hi, my name is Tamara Trujillo and I teach in the English department.
And my name is Deidre Hughes and I teach in the reading department. We're here today to talk to you about active reading strategies that you can use to be a more effective reader.
We're going to take you through different tasks of the different stages of the reading process. And those three stages are pre-reading, during reading, and post-reading. We have an active reading checklist that you can print out and follow along with us, as well as an article that we'll be using to apply those strategies.
So take a minute right now, print those out, and then we're going to begin. So we're going to begin with pre-reading, which are strategies and activities that you do before you actually read the text. So these are in preparation to sit down and read the text itself. So we have a long list of pre-reading tasks, and we're not going to go through all of them. We're going to go through ones that we think would be particularly effective with this essay. We're going to begin with number 12, which is thinking about what we call chunking. So when you have a text, and particularly a long text, you might consider whether you want to break it down into texts and then execute pre-reading and during reading strategies chunk by chunk. This text is not particularly long. However, as a reader, I decided it might behoove me to go ahead and break it up into chunks because when I'm looking at it, it looks quite dense. There's a lot of text, there are no headings, and as I look at it, it looks relatively complex to read. So I'm going to go ahead and break it into chunks. The first chunk, and so follow along with me, and what I would like you to do is to mark the chunks on your text. The first chunk is chunk number 1, would begin in paragraph 1, and go through the end of paragraph 5. The second chunk begins at paragraph 6 and ends at the end of paragraph 10. The third chunk begins at paragraph 11 and goes to the close, to the end of paragraph 14. And 4, the final chunk, goes from paragraph 15 to the end. So you want to mark those chunks in the margin, 1, 2, 3, and 4, and we are going to pre-read and during read chunk by chunk. The second pre-reading strategy that we are going to practice today is reading the title and creating 2 guide questions. Guide questions are questions that you create from headings and from the title that will help to guide your annotations during reading. So they will help you as you answer the guide questions. You can figure out what to write in the margins. So we're going to take a look at the title, and we don't have headings in this essay, so we're just going to take a look at the title, which is altruistic behavior. And what I'd like you to do is to write 2 guide questions. The guide questions can begin with any word that would begin a question, but oftentimes why and how are the most profitable guide questions because they open up the answer to something bigger. So take a minute and challenge yourself and see if you can come up with 2 guide questions that begin with why or how, or you can use what or other questions too. But try to see if you can get why or how, and then of course you want to frame it around the title, altruistic behavior. Take a minute and do that.
All right, so I've written my 2 guide questions for the title. And the first one is, how will the author define altruistic? That's using that how beginning for that question. And then my second question is this a definition? Is altruistic behavior a definition? Is this text going to provide a definition? Is this title a challenge or a questioning of this definition? That's what I came up with for my 2, and those will guide my annotations as I read. All right, the third task that we're going to ask you to do for pre-reading is to consider the author. So look at any author information that's provided in the text. And the reason that you consider who the author is to provide a context for what you're going to be reading, and to also consider possible biases of the author and to mark the credibility of the author. So why don't you go ahead and take a minute and look and see if there's any author information for this text, and if there is, to just highlight, maybe write a few comments about the author and the information that's provided about the author. Okay, I'd like to show you what I wrote
after reading the introductory material about the author. So I highlighted his birth date, and I wrote next to it older, so he was born in 1928. I also noted that he's British and highlighted England. In addition, I noticed that he has 2 degrees, thereby realizing that he has quite a bit of credibility in his field. And he's a researcher in animal behavior, so I wrote a small note that the focus is animal behavior and zoology. Finally, that he's a writer and the audience is children and adults. And then the last sentence is particularly important, where the thesis is revealed. And I wrote thesis : selfless behavior, not actually so. This is all very helpful information to guide my reading of the text before I begin.
All right, the next pre-reading task that we're going to engage in is to read the first paragraph and highlight key sentences. That's number 7 on your active reading checklist. And so take a minute and just read that first paragraph and highlight anything that stands out to you, and then write one summative comment, a comment that just summarizes what you've read. Okay, when I did this activity, I noticed that this paragraph is actually quite short. So I didn't highlight an entire sentence. I highlighted some phrases or some words, and then I wrote my summative comment about those terms. And so what I highlighted was that it must have 2 properties, that it's helpfulness at a cost to yourself. And I translated that, or I summarized that idea with this comment that altruistic behavior must help someone else and hurt you, and that it requires sacrifice. That's an idea that I put in my own terms from what I highlighted.
The final pre-reading activity we would like you to do is to read the last paragraph. In the last paragraph, most authors are trying to emphasize what's most important in the essay. So reading it ahead of time can help you to create, to know what's most important and what you need to pay attention to while you read. When you look at the end of this essay, we actually see that there's a table in the last paragraph, and I looked at it and it seemed very difficult to understand, quite frankly. So I made the decision to read the last paragraph of text, which is paragraph 17. Take a minute, and I want you to read paragraph 17, highlight what you think is important, and write summary comments in the margins. So summarize what you think is important in paragraph 17. When I read paragraph 17, one of the first things I noticed in the topic sentence, the first sentence, was the words "this kind," and I immediately knew this referred back to something that had been mentioned previously, and I didn't know what it was. So I circled it and wrote in the margin, "what kind," just to help myself understand that there was something that was missing because I was reading it before I had read the entire essay. As I read it, I wrote a comment in the margin that folks actually anticipate recognition when we do selfless acts. And then I put key concept, motives behind action. I noticed that hidden motive was in the first sentence and the last sentence, so I highlighted those, realizing that motive must be pretty significant in this essay. So these are all important concepts to guide me when I actually start to read the essay. So one more pre-reading activity that we would like you to do is to write predictions about what you think the author will do in the essay. Remember, a prediction is a statement, not a question. And what you're trying to do here is to imagine, what do I think will happen in this essay? What we know about predictions is that strong readers are always in a predictive mode of thought. They're always predicting what's going to happen next. Similar to when you're watching a movie and you get engaged in the movie and you're always thinking about what's going to happen next. Strong readers do that too. But it can be challenging when you have a more difficult essay and you're not quite as engaged. So take a minute and write 2 predictions about what you think will happen in this essay. And write a little checkbox next to it so that you can confirm or deny it during post-reading. Okay, I just want to share with you the predictions I wrote. Yours may not be the same, but the 2 that I wrote are: the author will define altruistic behavior, and 2, the author will discuss primary motivations of humans. No prediction is wrong or right. Those are the predictions that I wrote. Yours may be similar or different.
We're going to now move on to the second stage of active reading, and that is during reading. And so we're going to take you, just like we did in pre-reading strategies, we're going to take you through some tasks for things to do while you're reading. So the first one that we're going to work on is to summarize
the text as we're reading it. So we've decided we're chunking the text, so we're going to take the first chunk of text. And what I would like you to do is to summarize in a word or a phrase what seems most important to you in the first chunk of text. As a reader, I can tell you that for the most part, most of my comments in the margin are summary comments. I'm just trying to make sure I understand what's being said. I paraphrase it in my own words so that when I come into class, I can glance in the margins and see what I thought were the main ideas. So take a minute, highlight what's important, and write summary comments in the margin for chunk 1. Now that you've completed that, I'd like to share with you some of the things that I wrote in the margin. So I have several comments, but some of the ones I wanted to highlight is paragraph 2. I made a comment, doesn't work in evolutionary terms, the idea of altruism. And then I like to abbreviate things, so in the third paragraph I put EV for evolution. EV theory equals and an equal sign. Humans must be selfish. I try to make my annotations as succinct as I possibly can to save myself time. I circled the word they in that same paragraph and wrote humans because I wasn't sure who that pronoun was referring to, and I figured it out. I asked a question, how does one explain selfless acts? And in the final paragraph, I wrote new definition of self. Self is a home for genes, which is an idea that came from the author.
All right, the next task that we're going to talk about is notice the examples and evidence used to illustrate and or support key ideas or concepts. So why don't you go ahead and look through your essay and try and remember what seems to be most important or what comes to mind most readily when you consider how the author proved some of his ideas. So take a minute and just write some of the evidence ideas, or you can highlight what you think is some of the evidence in the text. Okay, what I've chosen to mark was the evidence that's based around the example of the burning building, because that seemed to me to be the one that I most easily remember, and it made it concrete and vivid, some of the concepts that he was talking about in terms of altruistic behavior. So I noticed that in chunk 2, paragraph 7 and 8, he says that Desmond Morris talks about how when we see somebody in a burning building, whether it be a child, which he talks about, a friend, which he talks about in paragraph 8, and then, or if we see a kitten in a burning building, that our rush to go in and save them is based not on any acts of altruism, of self-sacrifice, of wanting to bring harm to ourselves to better someone else, but actually it falls under this category of what he calls genetic self-care. And in the case of the child being in the burning building, we rush in to save this child because it really carries our genes. So it's really of self-interest, and it's a selfish act to protect our own genetic progeny. And then he also talks about, in this example, that if we have a friend that's in the burning building, or somebody, whether we know them or not, some person in the building, that the reason that we run in to save them, or why we might do this, is because we confuse that genetic self-care. We confuse that person as being genetically related to us because we come from a tribal society, and so we make that substitution of child for this stranger. And then he takes this example or this evidence even further when he talks about in paragraph 12 in the third chunk of text, when he talks about there being a kitten in the building and that we run in to save this kitten. And again, he says that we confuse this genetic self-care, this impulse to protect our own genes with this kitten, and that we transfer those genes onto this kitten. So that's one piece of evidence that he gives. Another piece of evidence that he gives about there being no true altruistic behavior is this idea that he calls transactional behavior. And that is where we basically help somebody else as a way of kind of improving our own karma, or to kind of to get this payback later on. And again, he terms that transactional behavior. So it's the whole idea, like you scratch my back, I scratch your back, you scratch my back, that kind of idea. And And so those are the two pieces of evidence that I noted in the text that will help me to make this idea about his claim about altruistic behavior more concrete in my mind.
The next strategy you might consider using is bullet number 5, which are using think aloud and talking to the text sentence starts. These are really helpful if you have struggled in the past with not knowing what to write in the margin. So, because these give you the beginning of the sentence, and then you complete the sentence. And I've found that most students who struggle to write comments in the margin, if they have these sentence starts, the task is much easier. So the one that I'm just going to focus on is the big idea is. And so with chunk 1, I wrote, the big idea is, ... evolution doesn't support altruism. Humans must be selfish. To understand, we need to redefine the self as housing of genes, in quotes. So to me, this summarizes what the author is saying in chunk 1.
So far, in the during reading stage of the active reading process, we've talked about different tasks in the annotation process. And we've covered summarizing the text, we've talked about noting examples or evidence, we've talked about using think aloud or talking to the text strategies, and now I want to talk about making personal connections or writing your reactions to the text. So what you want to do is note any place in the reading where you have had some kind of reaction or response. This will remind you of the ways and places that you really engaged in the text in a natural way. So why don't you look through the reading and see if you can note places that you really wanted to make a comment or you had some kind of response to. Okay, some of the reactions that I had to this reading selection came in the second and third chunks. The first one was in paragraph 9, where Desmond Morris talks about how this is not, of course, a calculated process. It operates unconsciously and is based on an emotion we call love. I put a happy face there because I really liked the idea that my emotions or the emotion of love can be linked to a biological function or process, as is evolution. So I put a smiley face there because I really responded to that. The second response that I had came later on in paragraph 11, and that's where he talks about politicians, and he uses this term exploiting. It says politicians exploiting this ancient urge were easily able to spread the aid system even further to a national level called patriotism. What I put a little laugh comment in there because I thought it was funny how he noted that politicians are often stereotyped as being exploiters, and that he used that in his text to kind of further his point. So I wrote that as another reaction. Also in paragraph 12, he gives that whole example of the kittens being, in a burning building, and that we have this confusion of our genetic self-preservation when we follow that impulse, as we follow that impulse to go in and save that kitten. And I just wrote a smiley face there as well because I work with animal rescue, and of course I understand what he's saying when he mentions that we have a tendency to substitute animals for humans, whether they be our children or people that are members of our family. So I just kind of reacted to that one too. So those are the ones that I marked.
So now we're moving on to the post-reading stage of the active reading process. During post-reading, you're working to do a final processing of the entire essay. So post-reading activities are completed after you have pre-read the entire essay, and of course during read the entire essay. So they're done at the final stage.
And the first task of the post-reading stage that we're going to take you through is to write a short summary of the text. So here what you want to do is think back to the other stages and the activities that you've done in those stages and try and come up with one brief summary of what you think the author is trying to communicate in this text. So why don't you go ahead and do that now. Okay, so for me, what seemed to be a summative comment or the overall message that the author is trying to give is that he's trying to communicate that our philanthropic or generous nature is based on biology, that there is no such thing as altruistic behavior, there's no unselfish act, that actually this kind of behavior is part of our biological process and it serves an evolutionary function.
The next post-reading activity that we're going to do today is from number 4, and number 4 talks about taking short notes about any of the following things like theme, thesis, main idea, tone, evidence, plot, etc. We're going to focus on tone. So tone is the emotional quality of the text. So you want to ask yourself the question, what kind of emotional response did the author evoke in me, and what kind of emotional quality did the text carry with it? So take a minute and answer that. These are going to be adjectives that you use to describe the tone. So write down 1 or 2 characteristics that you think describe the emotional quality of the text. So I want to go ahead and share with you the tone or the emotional quality, even the attitude is a helpful word to think about tone of the text. When I read this text, what came to me was to describe the tone was instructive. The author seems very confident, calm, and logical. So there can be many different answers, but those are the adjectives that I would use to describe the tone of this text. Next, we're going to move on to number 8, which is to anticipate why the instructor assigned the text and respond appropriately. So I'm imagining this would typically be an assignment that would be in perhaps an English 100 course, college writing, or maybe a Reading 96 preparation for college reading course. And given that, oftentimes we would be writing some sort of paper and using quotes. So I'm going to imagine that my instructor would ask me to pull out quotes. And so therefore, I would go through, and I want you to go through and just take a look at the text you've read, you've annotated the entire text, and pick out the meaningful quotes in the text. The ones you think you might be able to use when you are writing a paper. So I just want to show you a couple of quotes that I thought were important in chunk 1. So I don't want you to over-highlight or pick too many quotes. In chunk 1, I picked 2, 3 quotes. The first one was in paragraph 3. It begins, evolutionary theory suggests that they must, like all other animals, be entirely selfish in their actions, even when they appear to be the most self-sacrificing and that's hard to say, philanthropic. So to me, this seemed like a very important quote. I'm summarizing the issue in the first chunk. I also highlighted the last sentence in chunk 1. We are only their guardians, protecting them from destruction as best we can for the brief span of our lives. He's referring to our genes, which I think is a key idea from chunk 1. Finally, the last thing that we would do, the last thing that we're going to do today as a post-reading activity is to confirm and deny our predictions. So as you remember, during pre-reading, we wrote down 2 predictions of things that we thought the author would do in the essay. My first prediction, as you will recall, is the author will define altruistic behavior. So what you want to do is you want to go ahead and put a check next to the box that you wrote for the first prediction, if indeed it was true. I think we can safely say that was true in this essay, so we go ahead and put a check next to it. The second prediction was the author will discuss primary motivations of humans. I think this also was borne out in this essay, so we put a check. I want to reassure you, though, that if you make a prediction and it turns out not to be true, the value of writing predictions is getting in the predictive mode of thought. It's not necessarily in predicting correctly. So you just want to go back, confirm and deny, and make sure that you do this final step to just check your predictions. Thanks a lot for joining us, and we hope that you found this activity to be helpful. A final comment is that we just want to reiterate that as a college student, it's very important to to be able to both read well, so that you can comprehend the text, and also to be able to write well, and that strong readers and strong writers can move back and forth between the reading role and the writing role. And the more that you fine-tune your ability to read well, the better, the more easily you will be able to write and clearly communicate your ideas, and vice versa. The more that you work on your writing skills, the more helpful it will be in order to help you comprehend and understand the different texts that you're asked to read in the college classroom. Best of luck.